In this episode of the Exploring Information Security podcast, what is FAIR, or Factor Analysis of Information Risk?
Computers now have primary control of critical functions.
Houston, recommend vector transfer.
Your go for APU shutdown on time.
Roger, go for deploy.
Nice to be in orbit.
Welcome to the Exploring Information Security podcast, where you will learn, explore, and grow your security mindset. I am your host, Timothy D. Block, and in this episode, we'll be exploring what is FAIR. With me to do that is Jack Jones, the cyber risk executive. Show notes can be found at exploresec.com/EIS. You can support the podcast by donating. Sign up for the newsletter. You can also give me feedback for the show. Timothy.dblock@exploresec.com. Hit me up on LinkedIn. If you hit me up on LinkedIn, let me know you listen to the show and we can connect. Rate the podcast on your favorite podcast platform as well. That helps support the show. So FAIR, as I mentioned already, is Factor Analysis of Information Risk. So this is a threat modeling technique, I guess you could say. But really, I found it as a good way of getting some sort of metrics and kind of getting some numbers around risk, which it's shocking to me that this has been around since the early 2000s, because I hear people all the time like, how do I quantify that? Well, this is a methodology to do that. It does take a little bit of getting into, but I definitely think this is something I want to explore more and get more into. So definitely think this is a really great episode, especially if you're trying to figure out some of the information, because it's already been figured out and there's a whole community around it. So you're not essentially necessarily starting from scratch. And Jack is the creator of it, so he's been around for quite a bit of time. Definitely a really great conversation and a really great guy. So with that, let's get right into it.
Factor analysis of information risk, or FAIR, is really just a logical decomposition of the factors that drive how much loss exposure a scenario represents. Maybe the scenario is an outage due to ransomware that was initiated through phishing, let's say. That's your scenario. And so how much risk do we have associated with that? Well, in order to make a reliable statement about how much risk an organization has from that scenario, you have to, or it helps a lot, to decompose the scenario into the factors that drive the frequency and magnitude component of risk. And that's what FAIR is. I like to think of FAIR as, first and foremost, a framework for critically thinking about risk. The fact that you can then use that to do qualitative or quantitative risk measurement is sort of a nice bonus. But first and foremost, it's this framework for thinking more clearly about the scenarios that we have to manage against.
And this all ties into threat modeling, correct? Because it's a framework for threat modeling, like you said, talking about risk. So I guess what was the onus to create this framework?
Well, I was a new CISO at Nationwide Insurance, and this was in 2001. And as a new CISO, one of the first things you have to do is put together a strategy and then go beg for money, right? So I went on my dog and pony show to the executives, and one of the executives listened to my spiel and then said, all right, so tell me, Jack, how much risk do we have? And I could talk about threats and vulnerabilities and whatnot, but I couldn't talk about risk, as a quantitative measurement. That's what he's looking for. How much risk do I have? I shrugged. I said, lots. And he said, if I spend these millions of dollars you're asking for, how much less risk will I have? And I knew I was in trouble then. So I kind of hung my head and said, well, they'll have less risk. And he knew he wasn't going to get a better answer. It was a teaching moment. He was telling me that, unless I could speak in those terms, he didn't understand the relevance of what I was talking about. And there were a lot of ways he could spend those millions of dollars where he understood what he was getting for it. And I was just asking for it, and he was supposed to hand that money over on faith, you know. And at the end of the day, I ended up getting my budget, but I knew it was based solely on faith. And that's not a responsible way, I think, for any organization, any department within an organization to seek a whole bunch of money. Because, as he said, there are a lot of ways he could spend that money that he understood what he was getting. And unless we can speak in those terms, a lot of executives just see us as expensive noise. And that's what I would argue is one of the huge reasons, maybe the primary reason why organizations struggle to get the kind of support that they feel they need from their executives, financial and political support for that matter. And because once I started using this to analyze risk within the organization and communicate to the executives about it, their ears perked up. They were like, oh, okay, I get it now. And what I found too, which was maybe a little bit of a surprise to me, is the executives that before had always seemed sort of very willing to just sign off on risk. Yeah, whatever, I'm going to do what I'm going to do, became much more risk averse. And if I went to them with, an analysis that said, this thing you want to do is going to introduce this much additional risk to the organization. If that number was big, they were like, no, not so much. What are my options? What can I do to achieve my business objective without, adding all that risk? And so it really changed the conversation. And so yeah, that was the catalyst for it. Was this meeting I had where I was pinned down by a guy and had no answers.
Yeah, that's amazing to me, because you're coming at this from, you said the CIO, right? So it's not even you're necessarily a CISO, and that's what I've heard before in the field.
No, I was
right?
the CISO.
Oh, you were the CISO. Okay, I thought you said
no. Sorry.
Okay. No, I thought you said CIO, which, okay. So so you were coming from a security perspective, but that is a conversation I hear about today, is how do you define risk? And you've already built this framework, and it's already been around for 23 years.
Yeah, exactly. Overnight success. And it really has been pivotal for me as a professional. I mean, being able to do things like, I stepped into a CISO role at one organization, and, after having an assessment done, it was clear that we had a pretty significant gap in one dimension of our, program, but it was the middle of the budget year. And that's not when you go, hat in hand to the executives, right? But this was significant enough exposure. I thought, no, I need to, the responsible thing to do is have this conversation with the executives. And so I did the analysis using FAIRS. Here's how much loss exposure we have from this set of scenarios because there's a gap we have. And if we fix that gap, here's how much less risk we'll have. And the ROI was compelling. And I went to the executives. That was easiest money I ever got. Middle of a budget year, they said, yeah, that's unacceptable. We need to fix that, and they, rob Peter to pay Paul, and this, is always the case in budget, and there are finite resources, and they, I was able to make my case convincingly and could explain where the numbers came from. It wasn't just shit Jack made up. There's a model here. There's a process here. There are experts we got, numbers from and whatnot. And so it was, the case was made.
Yeah, that's interesting. And so this can be applied across any organization, correct? 'Cause I always, Yeah, I thought it was financial, but I mean, it technically is because you're. I'm assuming you're tying some sort of financial,
Yeah.
to the risk, right? You're actually giving a dollar figure of like, if we're going to go this way, then here's how much it's going to cost you. And so, are you taking in? Is this like a standard thing? Are you like adjusting for like the current landscape, or like how does that all work?
Yeah. I mean, when you do the analysis, you're taking, the best data you have at the time, which sometimes isn't great, but you always have some data. Even if, and there's a lot of misperception around quantitative analysis. One of the misperceptions is that you need some, let's say someone took statistics in high school and they learned in statistics, you need certain number of data points in order to do quantitative analysis. Well, that's not true. and there are people, I don't know if you've heard of a guy named Douglas Hubbard. He's written a book, How to Measure Anything, and how to measure anything in cybersecurity risk and whatnot. And he's like the world's leading expert in quantitative measurement in when you have uncertainty in your data. And he's proven empirically that you don't need gobs of quantitative data points in order to do quantitative analysis. You can do it with very little as even what's referred to as calibrated subject matter expert estimates, right? Everybody talks about, SMEs will just guess at numbers, right? Well, yeah, they will unless you calibrate them. And there's a very specific process for doing that, which means you can get really quite good numbers from experts if you know what you're doing. So, the bottom line is sometimes you don't have great data and you have to rely on subject matter expert estimates, but those can still be incredibly useful. And the other thing I like to point out is, so I'll very often get, arguments that, we don't have enough data to do quantitative, so we just do qualitative. Okay, so what are you basing your qualitative scores on? Do you have to be using some form of data? Because otherwise you'd be just flipping a coin. So what causes you to rate this a medium versus a high? And people don't realize, but when they're doing this as a risk measurement, they're using a model. It's their mental model. Nobody knows what it's constructed as, what elements are included or excluded. They're using data. They don't, and nobody else knows what data they're using, right? But still, somehow they came up with medium. Okay, so so if you're going to measure something, you're always using some sort of data. Doesn't it make sense to at least be explicit in your use of data? Okay, and being able to say, these are the numbers we used, and this is where they came from. They may be not nearly as good as we'd like them to be in terms of the quantity of values and whatnot, but at least we're being explicit about it, and that makes the conversation and dialogue around it so much easier. So,
well, and that could be the first step, right, to getting better data.
And that's an amazing point you just made too. I'm so glad you brought that up, because when you do these kinds of analysis, and let's say one of your data points you had to revert to subject matter expert estimate, you're like, okay, we'll calibrate them, we'll get the best numbers we can out of that. But hey, if we were actually logging on that system, we wouldn't have had to make those estimates. We could actually work from empirical data. Okay, so the other thing that this does, sort of the rigor around this, is it brings to the surface a lot of these opportunities to better understand our problem space and to improve our sources of data. So.
Yeah. So so I want to define really quickly, what's the difference between quantitative data versus qualitative?
Qualitative is what's referred to as ordinal. In other words, they're in order. So high, medium, low, they're in order. Mm-hmm. Now, the problem with that, and the same thing if instead of high, medium, and low, we use colors. There's a perceived order, red through green,
Yeah.
it's ordinal.
Mhm.
But here's the thing. Let's say we're using a 5-level scale, or let's say we're using NIST's 4-level scale, NIST CSF, right?
Mhm.
That's an ordinal scale. That 1, 2, 3, and 4, those are qualitative. Those aren't quantities, they're qualities. They're labels for buckets. There's literally no difference between that 1 through 4 scale and a color scale or a scale that's labeled with words. But this is one of my pet peeves in our profession. It's not just our profession, it's pervasive outside our profession. Is people believe that when they're using a numeric scale like the 1 through 4 from this, that they can do math on it and the math will make sense. And that's not even remotely true. When you do math on ordinal scales, you just did math on colors.
Yeah.
And the numbers will never stand up, other than maybe by happenstance, but certainly not reliably. And the way I like to sort of explain that is, all right, so let's say we believe that, we use the 1 through 4 scale, and we believe that we can do math on it and get numbers that make sense, results that make sense. Okay, well, instead of 1 through 4, let's use -8, 2, 55, and 1026 as our numbers. They're still in the same order. That math that we thought was working before, is it going to work now? No, it's not going to make any sense whatsoever. The only thing that's changed is the numbers. Literally nothing has changed. We're still doing math on colors. And the fact that, we and other professions believe that that's sort of a legitimate approach is unfortunate, because it leads to some really poorly informed decisions.
Mm-hmm. Well, so quantitative would be more, I guess, like dollar amounts is tied to.
Yeah, maybe I should have led with this, but the simplest way to distinguish between qualitative and quantitative is, in quantitative you have a unit of measurement. It's a percentage. It's a dollar. It's a frequency. It's there's some unit of measurement. Whereas like a 1 through 4 scale or a color scale, there's no unit of measurement. 1 through 4 what? 1 what? 2 what? There's no unit of measurement there. That's probably sort of the more official difference or obvious difference.
Yeah. Okay. That makes sense. So how do you get started then with FAIR if you're trying to build a case for, getting budget essentially?
How do you use FAIR in an analysis?
Yeah, like how do you get started? Like what's step one, and then like how do you actually use it properly too, right? Because I feel like some of these frameworks can be misused, right? Yeah.
And FAIR is like any other model or framework, can be misused and abused intentionally wise. So the first thing is always understand what decision you're trying to find an answer for, right? Are we trying to prioritize? Are we trying to understand ROI? Are we just trying to help a decision maker or the executives understand how much exposure the organization has to a particular scenario? But understand sort of the decision you're supporting. Next thing you do is you scope the scenario. What's the asset at risk? Is it sensitive information? Is it sort of operational? Is it, uptime? Are we trying to avoid an outage? Okay. Is it intellectual property? So what are we trying to protect? And so you understand the asset, then you understand who or what is the threat against the asset. Is it, a cyber criminal? Is it a disgruntled insider? Is it an insider who makes a mistake, accidentally, crashes a database or something like that by not knowing what the hell they're doing? Is it a weather event? Is it, physical violence, whatever the case might be? So understand the threat, understand sort of the systems and processes that are part of this equation, if you will. So bad guy wants to access this information. How do they get there? What's sort of the path to get there? And then what are the control conditions on those paths? And how is the threat agent, the bad actor, likely to perform their malicious deed, right? Is it going to begin with phishing? Is it going to begin with compromise of a vulnerable web application? Is it, going to come through a third party? These sorts of things. So you want to understand the bottom line is you want to understand the asset. You want to understand the outcome you're trying to prevent, loss of data or an outage or whatever the case might be, data integrity violation, and who the bad actor is and how they're likely to do what they intend to do.
Then how do you get that number, that number out of it, right?
And that's where the FAIR model itself begins to play a more obvious role. So within the model, there's this notion of threat event frequency. How often do we think the threat landscape, someone in the threat landscape will attempt this malicious deed? Or maybe it's not a malicious deed, but let's say we're talking about malicious deeds. How often are they likely to attack a web application or do phishing attacks, those sorts of things? So get a frequency there. And you never, another misperception is that you're supposed to come up with a number, right? They're going to attack 12 times this year. There's no way to know that, right? We're talking about the future. The future is always uncertain. So you should always represent it as a range, right? Between, 5 times and 20 times, based on history, based on, the direction the threat landscape has been leaning, right? The data we've been seeing and whatnot. We believe the threat event frequency would be between this number and this number, but most likely say this number somewhere in between. Right? And with that, by using a range like that, we're able to apply methods that have been used in other disciplines for ages to do what's referred to as stochastic analysis, or essentially taking random samples from that range a whole bunch of times. Again, it's something that's been used in other disciplines forever. Insurance uses it, physics uses it, economists use it, that sort of thing. So let's say we've done that for threat event frequency. We've gotten a range of numbers. Then we say, okay, how susceptible do we believe we'd be to that attack? In other words, what's the probability of the attack being successful? All right, that's going to be a number between 0 and 1. It's going to be a percentage. And here again, you don't know exactly. So you're going to take into account sort of the resistive controls that you have in place. Maybe that's encryption, maybe it's authentication, maybe it's users who've been trained in recognizing phishing attacks, whatever the case might be. You look at these controls and you say, well, we believe that with these controls, our susceptibility is between 5 and 10%, let's say. 5 to 10% of the attacks we believe would be successful. Right? And here again, you'd apply that random sampling within that range to generate a series of results that you use in this, in your spreadsheet, or if you're using a commercial tool. There are commercial tools that apply FAIR to make this a whole lot simpler than what I'm describing here. And then you do the same thing for losses. Well, FAIR breaks losses into primary losses and secondary losses. Primary losses are losses that occur directly as a result of an event. So maybe a retail web application goes down, right? You're spending money on people to bring it back up. You're losing revenue, that sort of thing. So direct losses. Then the secondary losses are you can think of as fallout, right? And this would be fines and judgments. This would be reputation damage, customer churn, that sort of thing. So you look at primary losses and secondary losses, and you talk to, say, your legal folks, get estimates on fines and judgments. You talk to your sales and marketing folks to understand, churn rates, and churn is an example of reputation damage, right? And a lot of people say that reputation can't be measured, reputation damage can't be measured, and that couldn't be further from the truth, right? Reduction in share price, reputation damage, increased cost of capital, reputation damage, churn, reputation damage, increased costs associated with regulatory scrutiny, increased regulatory scrutiny. That's reputation damage. So, yeah, that's another myth out there, unfortunately. It's commonly believed. But at any rate, you've gotten these numbers. You plug it into the FAIR model, and it gives you this annualized view of loss exposure. It can tell you, how frequently losses would be expected to occur and the magnitude of those losses. And of course, it would do that as ranges, because you put ranges in, you're going to get ranges out. And then let's say you've done that across several scenarios, right? And then you will have quantitatively be able to prioritize those scenarios. We care a lot more, let's say, after doing this sort of analysis, we care a lot more about a phishing scenario that ends up in a ransomware than we do distributed denial of service or a regular data breach thing, perhaps, right? So being able to focus on, all right, these are the scenarios that we have the greatest exposure to, and then you can begin to examine control improvement opportunities that then will reduce your exposure to those scenarios, and that's where you get your ROI sorts of results, saying, well, if we add, EDR, let's say, we have this much less risk from this, that, and the other scenario, those sorts of things.
Yeah, so it sounds like, and it's FAIR. I guess FAIR is a framework. Is that just like available for anybody to go grab? Is that like you put it into a spreadsheet, or you mentioned tools, but
yeah, absolutely. It's an open industry standard. The Open Group has published the Open FAIR standard. They have a professional certification around it. They have training materials. And the FAIR Institute, I don't know if you're familiar with the FAIR Institute, but it's a nonprofit that has 15,000 members from around the world. It has local chapters in 20-some cities around the world. It has free membership and just tremendous amounts of resources for people who want to learn and share and ask questions and sort of draw from the community around this. So there's, when someone sort of begins on this journey of trying to understand and apply this, they're not alone. There's tens of thousands of people out there who's on the same journey.
Yeah, I was going to add, my next question was be like, what skills do you feel like you have to have, or at least, gain as you're going through this journey?
The one requisite skill, right, is critical thinking skills. If you're not a critical thinker, I wouldn't bother going down this journey, right? Because we're dealing with a complex problem space. We're dealing with uncertainty and data and these sorts of things, and we have to be comfortable dealing with complexity and uncertainty, and that's sort of the cornerstone of critical thinking. So and there are people out there who are brilliant at what they do, right, but they view the world as black and white, right? They don't deal with complexity or uncertainty well. This is not something they should embark on. So I'm sure you, just sitting there, I'm sure you can think of people in your circle of acquaintances who super smart, super good at what they do, but they view the world as black and white.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, they shouldn't be doing this.
That's a great description as kind of like a side thing is critical thinking is like, I've always wondered how you really define that. And I think that's a really good description is you have to deal with complexity and uncertainties. You have to kind of like there's a little bit of everything about there. You have to solve problems, and you have to do it from a very creative standpoint.
Yeah, and that creativeness is a great observation. You have to be able to sort of turn the Rubik's Cube and look at it, a problem, from different perspectives.
Mm-hmm.
And again, some people are excellent at that, and some people are not. And again, that's not those people that aren't good critical thinkers, they have their superpowers, and they can run circles around me in the things that they're really good at. But they would be very unhappy trying to do this, and they wouldn't be, generate good results and that sort of thing. I've seen organizations adopt FAIR, and then, they say, oh, we're going to do this. We're going to do this quantitative stuff. And then they look around and they say, who can we assign to do this? And they look for some warm body, right? Who's maybe not busy as some others, right? And they go, you're our new quant guy. And the person's going, well, that never ends up well. That never ends up well. So yeah, it's that is the criteria. If you're comfortable with numbers, you don't have to know statistics. You don't have to, if you've had high school math, all right, you're fine. All right, this is not mathematically complicated, especially if you're using a commercial tool, right? If you want to do this in a spreadsheet, you're going to have more numeric skills. But if you're using a commercial tool, no, you don't need calculus or statistics or any of that stuff.
Are you seeing AI be applied to this? Like, could that replace a spreadsheet?
Eventually, I think it can be. Now, it would be a disaster to try to do it, because AI is only as good as the training it receives, right?
Mm-hmm.
And unfortunately, so much of what exists in our profession to date is so bad from an analytics perspective that if you trained an AI on it, you'd have a super fast idiot. It would be, the results would be hideous. So just to give you a sense for that, I asked one of the AI, chat GPT things out there, I said, give me a list of the top risks for a large hospital and express estimates of frequency and magnitude quantitatively. All right. What it gave me back was, first of all, the list of risks it gave me weren't risks.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Secondly, it gave me, guess what? Ordinal numbers, not quantities, right? It gave me, a 1 through 5 range sort of answer. That's, if that's, and this is, one of the most powerful chat GPT things out there, and is drawing from all the material, our profession has published since forever. That's the best it could do.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sorry. And until we have a body of data and knowledge that we can train an AI on, whether ChatGPT or a large language model or something more dedicated and designed for this, until we have something really solid like that, we're not going to be able to leverage AI.
Gotcha. Okay. Well, and I was thinking more from you have the data set, you've done all the work already.
Okay.
And then you can have it do kind of what you're talking about is the analytics on it, right?
Yeah. If you have the data, if let's say you've analyzed a population of scenarios for an organization and you've generated these results, then you could use a large language model to say, you could ask it a question, in my portfolio, in our organization's risk portfolio, what's our greatest risk? What's our most significant risk? And it can look through the data and tell you that, right? But we have to feed the AI, a reasonable quality data.
Yes.
And today that doesn't exist. Now there are certainly vendors claiming to do this. I'm going to claim BS on that. I mean, again, I should be clearer when I say this. So there are vendors who are claiming to use AI to do the analysis itself, right? That I think is baloney. There are, however, vendors who generate the data not using AI, but use AI to sort of draw insights from it. That, yes, that can be done.
Gotcha. Yeah. And I see what you're saying. That we're probably years away from it, just going, hey, do an analysis of our organization and having it go. You kind of still have to do a little bit of work there. So, no, that's good. That's good. What are some of the common challenges for using FAIR? And I know you've mentioned a couple of them, but are there any others that kind of popped to mind?
Yeah. So the challenges tend to be sort of mental. All right. So a lot of people believe that you have to have perfect data to do quantitative analysis. So they will spend literally months trying to dredge up data to do an analysis. Well, while they've been spending these months trying to dig up data, the world has moved on, right? Decisions have been made, whatnot. You have the data you have, and there's diminishing returns also in terms of more data, you get this diminishing return on that. So very often you can make, in fact, in the vast majority of the cases, you can make perfectly good decisions from data you've gotten over the span of a few hours or days rather than weeks or months, right? So there's this perception that you need perfect data, and organizations will drive themselves into the ground trying to look for more data. And it takes them too long to get results, and then they go, well, that doesn't work, and then they throw it aside, and then they go back to this for the risk measurements.
Yeah,
right?
no,
They get wound up about perfect data, and then they do this,
Yeah. That actually sounds like a lot within the threat modeling field, because I've been exploring I've been doing it for years, but I've been exploring it, and I see some of the complaints about not using this or doing this, but then when you look at it, it's like because you want the perfect thing. And to me, threat modeling, especially in the sessions, it's a little bit chaos, and you're never going to be perfect with it. And if you try to be perfect with it, it causes, like you're saying, like more problems, and then people just stop doing it, right? It makes it a miserable experience.
Yeah, exactly. So so that pursuit of perfect data is one of the big challenges. If people and if organizations can be comfortable with uncertainty in their data and use the methods and tools to effectively use uncertain data, then you'll be fine. Another sort of challenge is the skills. So it takes, there's a ramp up period for someone who's going to do this, just like threat modeling. Can someone walk in the door and do threat modeling? No, right? There are skills that have to be learned here. You have to learn the FAIR model. You have to learn how to do calibrated estimation. You have to, that sort of thing. And so there's this ramp up, and here again, organizations are like, but as soon as we train up someone, they get hired away from us. I've seen that over and over again. Organization will adopt FAIR, they'll train people up, they'll get the program going, and then those people get stolen by another organization.
Right? To me, that's a manager problem.
It is, but it's common, and unfortunately, we're at this sort of point in the life cycle of this sort of thing, quantitative risk measurement, where trained people are relatively few and far between. And so when you have your risk analyst get stolen, you very often can't replace them overnight, and that's frustrating, and it's problematic if you now have expectations from executives on getting these analyses done, that sort of thing. So there's that sort of skill set challenge. Another tends to be organizations will get a program up and running and being productive, and then some new executive will come in who's who's never done quantitative analysis, right? And they believe in red, yellow, green. That's all. Their whole world is red, yellow, green. And they'll say you can't do that anymore. And they'll stop the quantitative analysis simply because they don't understand it. So at any rate, those are kinds of challenges. Another challenge, and this one's unfortunately common, is trying to boil the ocean, trying to analyze everything. And, that can lead to analysis paralysis and burnout. So there are sort of practiced and proven methods for sort of getting a toehold, doing this in very specific ways to generate value, demonstrate value, and then grow from there. But don't try to boil the ocean out of the gate.
So that's one question I keep having, because I'm talking about threat modeling at conferences. Is like, is there a way to scale this, or is it really just a matter of people, right?
Well, the good news is over the last year, there are now vendors whose solutions make this a lot easier and a lot faster. So, for example, in full disclosure, I used to work for this company called Safe Security. And they have baked FAIR into their platform, and they ingest data from over 100 cybersecurity technologies. And they apply that data automatically in the analysis. They generate scenarios automatically. It is a largely automated process, right? Which means you don't honestly even have to be trained in FAIR. There are organizations adopting that are able to get right off the ground, getting analyses done within literally 15 minutes of starting.
Oh, wow. Okay.
So, the good news is these problems with bandwidth, trained bandwidth, and finding people with critical thinking skills and that sort of thing is going to be less of a problem going forward, because as more and more vendors begin to automate this, I think the situation will improve dramatically. Scalability will improve dramatically. So there's good news on the horizon there.
Gotcha. Okay. What tips would you give for people using FAIR?
Leverage the people in the industry who've been there, done that. It's a very enthusiastic, very sort of giving community. And if you ask, they will help. And if you're experiencing a particular challenge, it's almost guaranteed that 1,000 other people have faced that same thing.
Been there. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, found their way around that. There are, take training, and I would recommend FAIR training to people, even if they're going to use one of these automated solutions, because the automated solutions can't analyze everything. There are going to be scenarios that are just a little too odd, off the mark to have been automated. They still need to be analyzed. So and they're often the more interesting scenarios anyway. So training is useful for that, but it also tends to give people a very different perspective on cybersecurity. Mm-hmm. I've had over the years many people say that once they learned FAIR, they just couldn't imagine going back to doing security the way they used to do, because in retrospect to them, it didn't make any sense. So I think it provides new perspectives on what we do as a profession that can be really helpful, particularly in conversations with executives and regulators. I mean, I've been a CISO for 3 different companies, as regulated in each of those cases, and rather than having this sort of adversarial relationship with auditors and regulators, it became much more collegial and like, they had their list of things here's their checklist. Here are the things you should be doing. I'm like, yeah, here's the things we can check off as, yeah, we're good on that. Here are the things that we're working on, but you know what? We can't do them all. So we've had to prioritize, and we prioritize using this thing called FAIR, and when I give them sort of an overview and a grounding in FAIR, and I said, this is what we're using to prioritize, I get no more arguments. It's like, cool, you're on top of this, and it's really made those relationships and those conversations a lot smoother and less challenging.
That's awesome. Yeah, cool. What resources do you recommend for people that want to get into FAIR?
The FAIR Institute just has, become a member. It's free. The resources page has white papers and videos and literally hundreds of blog posts on almost anything you can imagine related to FAIR. So it's a great resource. The Open Group also has some training materials, and it offers that professional certification around FAIR. There's a book that I co-authored called Measuring and Managing Information Risk, a FAIR Approach, that was actually inducted into the cybersecurity canon as a must-read for the profession. So that's out there. So yeah, those are sources I would point people to.
Cool. Awesome. Well, Jack, it's been a pleasure talking to you about FAIR and getting to know it a little bit more. It sounds like a really great framework and resource to be, that organizations can apply. So thank you for joining me to discuss that.
Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity to be here.
And that will do it. Hopefully you learned something. If you didn't, email me at timothy.dblock@exploresec.com or reach out to me on LinkedIn and let me know what you didn't learn, and we'll cover it in a future podcast. We'll see you next time, Security Explorers.